Walter was the face of the team in the 80s. He was their big star along with Alvin Adams. When things went wrong for Walter and things went wrong for the team, it was no coincidence that those were connected. And people in Phoenix, to my recollection, there were people who were angry about what had happened because everybody liked Walter. Everybody wanted him to do well. Everybody wanted him to get better. And the fact that it wound up contributing to causing so much difficulty for the franchise just made everybody really sad. And so it was doubly hard when he left. Obviously, he wasn't going to stay with the Suns, but there wasn't a question in my mind that his number was going to be retired. He absolutely deserved that. And I think Colangelo made the right move by waiting a couple of years. I think that allowed more sympathy to come back into the equation among the fan base.
And you are in Australia right now.
You're talking NBA basketball. You're talking great teams. You're talking great individual players.
Takes it off, and there's number 23, and of course Johnny goes nuts.
We're all getting goosebumps thinking about it now.
I just tried to go out there and play my game.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Adam. I don't like anybody. I'm not a people person.
Strand, you make the pass. Yes. Christian, can you catch the ball? Yes.
All the stars were aligned and all the muscles fired at the right time, and I was able to get off the ground and throw one down.
I was saving that as a surprise for you.
And now, introducing your host for In All Airness, Adam Ryan.
Welcome to episode 134. Thanks for joining me. On November 2nd, 2023, six-time NBA All-Star Walter Davis died of natural causes whilst visiting family in Charlotte. Today, I welcome back a great friend of the show, Adam Beechin. We discuss Walter's life on and off the basketball court. Amidst his innumerable accomplishments, Davis was certainly no stranger to adversity. Despite battling substance abuse for the majority of his Phoenix Suns tenure, Walter averaged 20 or more points per season in 6 of his 11 campaigns in the Valley of the Sun. A quick sidebar, not mentioned within our recording, per basketballreference.com, on July 6, 1988, Walter was just the second player in NBA history to sign as an unrestricted free agent. He joined the Denver Nuggets one day after another would-be Suns legend, Tom Chambers, signed with Phoenix. In the lead up to recording this conversation, I put out a call for listener contributions. Tim Gallagher kindly answered the bell. Tim has collected sports autographs for more than 50 years and is a consignment director for Robert Edward Auctions. You'll hear Tim's reflections on Walter Davis as an interlude within this episode. Tim will also feature as a future guest on my podcast and has a wealth of incredible stories to tell. Show notes for this episode and access to a huge archive of past episodes are available at inallairness.com. Now, onto the show. My guest today makes his third appearance on the podcast. He's a Phoenix Suns superfan who resides in Los Angeles. I had the pleasure to meet him in person on 2 occasions. Most recently was February of 2020. Adam Beechin, thanks for joining me and welcome back.
Hey, Adam, thanks for having me. It's always fun.
Our episode today has come about solely because you reached out to me to ask if I was doing any sort of episode to honor Walter. That's what gave me the spark to look at researching more about his life. I must say that I've learnt so much in the lead up to this conversation today. So thank you for suggesting it and reaching out. And it's also great to just be able to reconnect, chat with you again.
I agree. And I'm always happy to tweak one of your favorite phrases, participate in some shameless Suns promotion. So thanks for having me.
That's fantastic. Thanks, mate. You're a gem. The life and times of one Walter Davis. He was born in Pineville, North Carolina, September the 9th of 1954 to be precise. Sadly passed away on November the 2nd, 2023. He just turned 69. When you think of the name Walter Davis, what springs to mind for you?
The first thing that springs to mind for me when talking about Walt Davis is his jump shot. That's the picture I see in my head when I see Walter, that perfect, beautiful jump shot. I think I tweeted this, once had the good luck to talk to Dick Van Arsdale, who's one of the original Suns, has been around the franchise for many, many years. And I asked him who had the best jump shot he ever saw. And he said Jerry West. And it's hard to argue with that, right? Mm-hmm. But he said Walter had the prettiest jump shot he ever saw. And that's how I feel. I have never seen anybody shoot a jump shot prettier than Walt did.
He attended South Mecklenburg High School in Charlotte, North Carolina. During his tenure there, he was a 2-time state champion on the varsity team, and his junior varsity team made the final when he was a sophomore, and they lost that, but he'd go on to win the next 2 seasons as a varsity member. In 1972, they had a 2-point win against Burlington William. Now, in that 1972 title game, Walt had 22 points, and he made 2 free throws with only 9 seconds left in what would be his final game as a senior to help secure that victory. As part of his accomplishments with that team, it included a streak of 40 straight wins over 2 years and just 1 loss in 52 games at South Mecklenburg High School.
It sounds like a pretty accomplished amateur career, but he was a natural. He was a natural at the sport. Every move he made on the court reflected that. None of it looked like it had been super practiced. It all seemed very natural. The flow of his game seemed very natural. Easy to imagine him, in those early years with that same playing style.
In April of 1972, he signed a grant in aid with the University of North Carolina. And interestingly, and this is something I only learnt in the lead up to talking today, he fell just shy of meeting the ACC's academic standards. So therefore, he chose to attend a prep school. It was called Sanford Prep School in Delaware for 1 year. And then he had hopes of transferring to the University of North Carolina, where he'd still have 4 years of eligibility. Fascinating wrinkle of Walt's story. Whilst he was in that prep school, he averaged 31 points, 18 rebounds, and 9 assists per game on 56% from the field and 89% from the free throw line. So fair to say he made a good impact there at Sanford.
I can't imagine that after that, North Carolina was like, we changed our mind. We don't want you. I'm sure that just made Dean Smith's mouth water at the possibility of getting Walt in there.
In mid-March of 1973, UNC assistant coach Bill Guthridge obtained Davis's signature, and that was announced the following day by the head coach, Dean Smith, who was in New York at the time. So what that meant was that a freshman Walt Davis would play with a senior Bobby Jones, who would be a future NBA Hall of Famer. And Davis was on the JV team at South Meck High School when Bobby was the standout on the Sabres varsity squad that won the 1970 state title.
In the lead up to this, I was reading about Walter as well, and I didn't know that about Bobby Jones. I did not know that they went to the same school. You can only imagine what it would have been like if the two of them had been playing at the same time on the same team. Pretty amazing that one school could produce 2 Hall of Famers.
It's quite incredible. And also, assistant coach Guthridge added in the article that I read, Walter's career record since he began playing organised basketball in the 7th grade is 127-10. So just something to chew on there as he enters his collegiate career at North Carolina.
Wow, he was probably picked first or second in just about every game he played in.
Yeah, first or second. I love the fact that he just had that little detour there where he went to prep school, still gave him the 4 years of eligibility. And for more reports, he actually improved his academic standing considerably, which then obviously helped his time that he was with the Tar Heels as well. As we record this, mate, the season that's forthcoming for the NCAA, it'll actually be the 50th anniversary of what is arguably the greatest shot in Walter's life. It was on March the 2nd of 1974 at Carmichael Auditorium. The Tar Heels freshman nailed a 25-footer at the buzzer, which capped a remarkable 8-point comeback in the final 17 seconds of regulation versus the visitors from Duke.
Gets it to Walter Davis. 2-1. Walter takes the shot.
North Carolina would rally to win in overtime 96-92. Probably one of the most decorated comebacks and greatest shots to force an overtime game in the history of college basketball.
Yeah, it was a beautiful shot. One of the things about Walter was that he was never afraid of pressure moments. He was never afraid to take the last shot. Maybe that's something peculiar to North Carolina because a number of players who have come out of North Carolina have had that same quality. I know Michael Jordan did.
During his tenure at North Carolina, he also participated in the 1976 Olympic Games. Now, I don't have a lot of information about the achievements of that team. I know they obviously went on to win gold after the shocking defeat 4 years prior in 1972, clouded in all kinds of controversy. Do you have anything you'd like to add at all from his tenure with that Olympic team in which they did win gold in 1976?
The thing I mostly remember about that team was that Dean Smith was the coach of that team, and he basically brought the entire Carolina roster with him to play in the Olympics. Phil Ford was on that team. Mitch Kupchak was on that team. So he certainly had a lot of familiar faces around him. What surprised me in looking back over that team's record was that Walter didn't really play a whole lot in the Olympics. Certainly didn't star for that team. That was Adrian Dantley, who was the big gunner for that team, and Phil Ford, who was everybody's favorite at that point. The kind of distributing point guard that everybody wanted. And Walter, for whatever reason, just never really got into many games. But I'm sure it was a tremendous experience for him in Montreal to have that gold medal put around his neck.
Gold medal game was on the 27th of July, 1976. I'm just looking at the box score now, courtesy of the greatbasketballreference.com. The US had a 95-74 win. As you mentioned, Adrian Dantley was the standout for sure. He had 30 points in the gold medal game. Walter Davis was in the scoring column, just had 2 points for that particular game. But the US went 6-0 en route to that gold medal. I actually read a couple of articles where it did say that Dean Smith was questioned by some how many Carolina players were on the roster, but he actually only had one vote in that actual say of who made up the US team. And there was a 10-man committee that actually chose the players.
You don't know what kind of lobbying he did behind the scenes. He may have gone to the whole committee and said, hey, I really need these guys. Do I remember right? Was Tom Lagarde on that team as well? He also was a Carolina guy. All four of those guys went on to the NBA and had careers, although Lagarde's was cut really short by injury. And so was Phil Ford's, really.
Yeah, I'm looking now. Lagarde definitely was in the gold medal game. He played and also scored 2 points as well, for what it's worth. Now, moving on to the 1977 college season, the Tar Heels were the Atlantic Coast Conference regular season and ACC tournament champion. As a senior, Davis led the Tar Heels to the NCAA championship game before they ultimately lost to Al McGuire and his Marquette Golden Eagles, 67-59. Walter was the leading scorer. He had 20 points and added 8 rebounds, 3 assists, and 2 steals. The Tar Heels, on their way to that final game, their 4 tournament wins were by a combined total of just 13 points. So they had to fight to get there, and ultimately, unfortunately for Tar Heels fans, they couldn't quite get over the hump there in what would be Walter's last game as a college player.
When I think about that year's finals, what comes to mind is that it was Al McGuire's last run as a coach. And so I think a lot of the attention on that tournament was on Al retiring. And I think that Carolina was sort of regarded as a team everybody expected to win, but I think Marquette was the team everybody wanted to win. It was a good game, but you're right. That team did have to fight. Those were low-scoring games, I think, that led up to the final. Carolina was still able to use the four corners offense at that point. There was no shot clock. And so the games really tended to slow down.
Over his 4 years at UNC, just a few stats here, Walter's teams had 22, 23, 25, and 28 wins. So they increased their wins each season. And some of his many accolades include an All-ACC second team in 1976, and he was named first team in 1977. He was All-ACC tournament second team in 75, 76, and 77. And he was named to the postseason All-Tournament team in 1977. And per basketballreference.com, he left UNC with averages of 15.7 points, 5.6 rebounds, and 3.4 assists per game. And per the UNC Media Guide, he ranks 10th all-time still in career points at 1,863. And he scored double figures in 106 of 119 games with the Tar Heels. So some pretty impressive stats there across his 4 years at North Carolina.
Yeah, I didn't know that he had scored double figures that many times. That's really impressive, especially against ACC competition. You know, at that time, Dean Smith got a lot of criticism for not letting his best players really shine. It was about the team system. Obviously, they had a lot of success with it, but there was a sense that nobody really knew how good some of these players were because they weren't getting the ball in their hands as much as star players would, and they weren't getting as much floor time. So they were kind of unknown quantities to everybody except really serious NBA scouts. Nobody really knew how good Walter Davis was going to be.
That's a great point you make, because when he had that 1 year at the prep school prior to his Tar Heels tenure, he tore it up. Obviously, it's against not quite as good quality player, to be fair, but he certainly could score with the best of them. And then again, as you said, he would go within the Dean Smith system like so many players did, most famously Michael Jordan. Dean Smith, the only guy to hold Jordan under 20 points per game, as the saying goes. Most people would probably be aware that Walter Davis is the uncle of the current North Carolina Tar Heels head coach and former NBA player and Tar Heels player, Hubert Davis. Let's get to the 1977 NBA draft. It was held in New York in June. Walter was selected the 5th overall pick by the Phoenix Suns. Now, other NBA All-Stars drafted in that same draft include Otis Birdsong, Ricky Green, Eddie Johnson, fast Eddie Johnson, Marcus Johnson, and Bernard King, Norm Nixon, and Jack Sikma. Now, only Birdsong and Marcus Johnson were selected ahead of Walter. So some great company that he's in from that 1977 draft. The first 4 seasons of his career, if I'm not mistaken, in the NBA, he was an all-star, which was fantastic to boot as well.
I think the Suns went into that draft actually wanting Greg Ballard out of Oregon. And I think the Bullets took him 1 pick ahead of Walter Davis. So Walter wasn't really even the Suns' first choice at that point, but I'm sure they were glad to get him. He was obviously going to be a talent. We just didn't know how good of a talent he was going to be. Suns were pretty lucky to have him land in their laps. And the fact that he was picked above many of the people that you just mentioned goes to show you the quality of that draft. The first pick was Kent Benson, who hardly anybody remembers, unfortunately, a great college player, but didn't have much of a pro career. But after that, it was just all-star after all-star.
Ken Benson missed the 1976 Olympics due to injured, I think he had a broken wrist. He couldn't actually be the centre position that Dean Smith had actually hoped that he would be. Quick overview of just some of the great achievements that Walter had in his tenure with the Phoenix Suns. How's this for a rookie season to start with? In 1978, Davis was named an All-Star. He won the Rookie of the Year, and he made the All-NBA second team. He'd be an All-Star and All-NBA second teamer the following season too. As I mentioned, he played in 4 more All-Star games after 78 and 79, which gave him 6 total appearances. The other games were in 1980, 84, and 87. Coincidentally, 3 of those years that he played as an All-Star in 1978, 81, and 82 were with Bobby Jones on the roster as well.
It was a case of a perfect marriage of player and coaching style. John McLeod loved to run. A great team that was built for that, and Walter fit in pretty seamlessly. One of his many nicknames was the Greyhound. And when you watched him in transition out on the break, it's exactly what he looked like. He was long, he was graceful, and he was on a straight line, and he was amazing doing that stuff. He also came to a fairly loaded Suns team. The year before, they hadn't been very good because of a lot of injuries, but the year before that, they had been in the finals. So they had a lot of talent on that team. Alvin Adams, Paul Westphal was on that team. By that time, they had traded for Don Buzzi, who had been an all-star with Indiana. So they had a lot of really good talent on the team, and Walter benefited from having some great passers around him in particular. And he fit like a glove with that team. And that was his best year in the NBA.
I mentioned the 1987 All-Star game. There's a fantastic photo that's been circulating recently. It's James Worthy, Michael Jordan, and Walter Davis, I assume, before that game. They're all in their spectacular warm-ups. Obviously, the Carolina connection.
I have a story about that, not about the photo, but about his relationship with Michael Jordan, if you're interested in hearing it.
Absolutely, mate. Absolutely, I'm interested.
The one time I ever came face-to-face with Michael Jordan was the season that he broke his foot, and I was still a teenager. My father and my stepmother lived in Chicago, and I would go to Chicago for holidays. One year, we were arriving at the building, and there was a little teeny car out in front with a license plate that said Jump 23. I may have told this story before on your show. And as we're watching, Michael gets out of the car and sort of unfolds himself in all of his glory with the big boot on his foot. And he walks into the building. And I said to my dad, "What's Michael Jordan doing here?" My dad said, "Well, he's got a girlfriend," he wasn't married at the time, "who lives in the building." Okay. So we walk in and we round the corner to the elevators, and we can see the doors are closing on an elevator. And my dad says, "Hold the elevator." And this enormous hand comes out and grabs the door and forces it back. And we step inside, and now it's my father, myself, and Michael Jordan alone in an elevator. I, of course, didn't say anything because I didn't want to be that guy. So I'm sure that Michael appreciated that to this day. But my dad had no such compunctions and started talking to him about the Bulls, started talking to him his career. It must have been a long elevator ride. But anyway, it was the year that, and we'll get to this, I'm sure, that the drug scandal had broken in Phoenix and Walter had gone into rehab. And so my dad asked Michael about it. Michael said, he was my hero growing up, which I don't think I really knew. But Michael really took a lot of inspiration from Walter Davis. I think you can see it in their games. You can see a lot of the same kind of physicality. Walter Davis wasn't as explosive as Michael Jordan, but they had the same kind of grace, the same kind of body control in the lane. So you can see traces of that game in Michael's game later on.
That's a fantastic story. You did mention it in a previous episode. If that's not reason enough for anybody to go back and listen to that, then I don't know what is, but that is fantastic. And I was hanging on every word again, even though I knew where it was going for a majority of it. So thanks again for sharing that with us. You did allude to the troubled times in both the franchise history and also in the personal life of Walter Davis. You know more about this than me by far, I'm sure. So feel free to elaborate on some of the troubles that he had and, of course, the team during that period of time in the mid-'80s where they really were almost at rock bottom as a franchise.
The peak of Walter's career were really his first 5 years with the team. The problem with those teams were, first, that they didn't really have a lot of bangers on that team. That was a very finesse team, and they got out-muscled a lot. After a couple of years of that, they started tinkering with the team, bringing in bigger guys. They brought in Truck Robinson. They brought in Maurice Lucas. They brought in James Edwards. And they never really found the perfect fit for the team. And so the team was at playoff level in Walter's early years, but they couldn't really get over the hump. There was a sense of futility, I think, after the first couple of years of Walter's career, where he played very well and he was, along with Alvin Adams, the face of the franchise. But he had some personal demons, succumbed to some temptations that happened around the middle of the 80s. He got addicted to cocaine. And I think he had been to rehab already at least twice before he was busted by police. And in exchange for immunity from prosecution, he revealed names of other people who he knew had been buying and or selling drugs. And some of those were his teammates, past and present. And that didn't endear him to the franchise at all, and made it almost impossible when he came out of rehab to rejoin the team for him to be accepted. So the writing was on the wall at that point that his son's career was pretty much over. And by 1988, it was. It's a shame that a lot of the NBA world remembers Walter for that and not for how well he played his first couple years in the league. He was probably on his way to being a Hall of Famer, certainly seemed to be on the track for it. But, circumstances of his making and not of his making sort of conspired against him.
That's really well said. And obviously he battled some tremendous demons along that way. In his post-playing days, he was involved with a couple of franchises in terms of community ambassadorship and things of that nature as well, in amongst other roles he had as a commentator and whatnot. He definitely tried to redeem himself as best he could and fell back into the good graces of the Suns franchise, which we'll get to a little bit later in terms of his jersey being retired and, of course, his entry into the famed Ring of Honor.
Hi, this is Tim Gallagher, responding to Adam's request about Walter Davis memories. I first saw Walter Davis play in 1976 when North Carolina played at Miami of Ohio. And I remember getting off of basketball practice, changing and driving down to Oxford, Ohio, where Miami University was. And North Carolina had Phil Ford, Mitch Kupchak, Walter Davis. Dean Smith, of course, was coaching. He hadn't won a title yet, but the program was very significant, and following them and having them come in the local area for a game was a big deal. I remember that North Carolina team and waiting after the game to get autographs of Phil Ford, who was on a Sports Illustrated cover by that point. And then Kupchak and Walter Davis were also significant players, and they'd soon be U.S. Olympians on the 76 Olympic team. The next memories of seeing Walter Davis play were my years in Phoenix, which were 1980 to 87, which aligned quite closely with his peak years with the Suns. He'd been there a few years, but was just coming into his own as an all-star. And just watching him play, he had a certain joy that he played with, and a great outside shooter, but also little floaters and runners along the baseline and in the lane. I remember he seemed to get his rhythm going to his left on his jump shot, but he would go on benches in games where, it seemed like he'd score 10 or 12 points in a row and really got the crowd excited. And I remember sometimes when he'd score, he'd do a little jump of joy, so to speak, before running back on defense. Not anything that would disrupt him getting back in time on defense, but it just was in him. So just a lot of fun to watch him play. The other memory I have of him, he hurt his knee. And I remember driving down along North Central Avenue, and there were some dirt paths for walking, horseback riding, that kind of thing, which went on in Phoenix, probably still does in certain areas. But I remember seeing Walter rehabbing from his injury and jogging along that dirt trail along Central Avenue. And I drove alongside, put my window down and yelled out, "Sweet D," and just kind of raised my fist. And he gave me a raised fist as well of thank you for the encouragement kind of thing. So just a wonderful player to watch, always a good guy to encounter, kind of a shy and humble guy, but always a good autograph signer. And why he's not in the Hall of Fame, I don't really understand, with his number of all-star appearances and Olympic gold medal. And again, stack his numbers up against a lot of guys that are already in the Hall, and he should be in there, in my opinion. Good memories of one of my all-time favorites. He was so good, he had 3 nicknames, Sweet D, the Greyhound, as well as the Man with the Velvet Touch. Suns broadcaster Al McCoy had some great nicknames for the players during that time, and he would call Walter the Man with the Velvet Touch, and he certainly did. R.I.P. Walter.
Just in terms of his career high in scoring, I'm always loving to check some of these stats out. Basketball Reference suggests that his career high was a 45-point game versus the Utah Jazz on January the 15th of 1987. The Suns had a 123-107 win, and his stat line was 18 of 32 from the field, and he had 4 rebounds, 7 assists, and 2 steals. There's not enough footage of Walter, I don't think, particularly during his peak period, as you said, those first 4 or 5 seasons in the league. So there is some scant videos on YouTube. So it's definitely worth having a look at for sure as a reference to how good he was.
Walter came into the league as a small forward, the position he played in college, and he was too quick for other NBA small forwards at the time. Walter was never a rebounder. He was never really an assist maker. He was a pure scorer. He could run like the wind, and guys couldn't keep up with him. But after a couple of years, Coach McLeod switched him to guard, put him in the backcourt, because he wanted a bigger backcourt to compete with the Lakers of the world. So you had 6'6" Walter Davis and 6'4" Dennis Johnson playing in your backcourt. That's pretty good. But it took away, I think, a number of the things that Walter did really well. It moved him out of the paint where he was able to do a lot of his scoring in his early years, and that was tough. A year or two later after that, he broke his elbow and missed most of a season. I'm not sure that his shot was ever completely the same, but it certainly sapped him of an important year of his career. It's a lot of what might have been for Walter in his time with the Suns.
As you mentioned, 1988 was his last season in Phoenix. He then signed as an unrestricted free agent with the Denver Nuggets in July of 1988, where he'd spend a total of 4 seasons with the franchise. Anything at all from his tenure with the Nuggets that particularly stands out or is worth making reference of, mate?
It was sad to see him in another uniform. He had some good years with Denver, not years like his peak years. It was a different kind of team. He was a different kind of player at that point. He'd had a number of injuries, but it was just hard to watch him in a uniform other than the Suns, especially for my age. I was 8 years old when Walter came to the team. We didn't have a pro franchise in town other than the Suns at that point. And so when Walter came, he was a rookie like all the rest of us enjoying the Suns. We really felt like he was one of us. He was very much a part of the community. You could see him around town in grocery stores or out and about doing whatever in his daily life. I went to basketball camp at the Jewish Community Center, and he was always a guest there. I came by many times. I had his autograph on multiple shirts. And he was great with kids. He really liked being around people who were learning the game. He was nothing but kind. And so when he left, it was really hard to imagine the Suns without him. And that's what really started their downward spiral in the 80s. And then when he passed away last week, really kind of felt like a death in the family. You grew up watching Walter Davis, and it's hard to imagine him not being around.
It sure is, mate. In between that 4 seasons that he had total with Denver, which included his final season of 1992, he also was a member of the Portland Trailblazers. In late January of 1991, he was part of a 3-team trade where the Nuggets dealt him to the Blazers, and then he'd later be waived by Portland just ahead of the 1992 season starting. another little wrinkle as part of what his career amounted to.
It's easy to imagine him being a great sixth man later in his career, instant offense coming off the bench, particularly for a team like Portland. For Clyde Drexler, Terry Porter, Jerome Kersey years, that was right in the middle of that, and he would have been a great asset to them. But, he was at the end of his career. He'd had a lot of miles put on those legs by that point.
So many what ifs, unfortunately, but this is the great thing about basketball history, fascinating to learn these different peaks and troughs that players have throughout their lives, both on and off the court in this instance particularly. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Phoenix Suns would retire Walter Davis's number 6 jersey in April of 1994. And given his history, as we've alluded to, and you went into some good detail about, there were some doubts whether the number would ever be retired. But Jerry Colangelo, the team owner, said that there was never a doubt, and he added this quote that I found ahead of our chat today. "We just wanted to let some time elapse, that's all. Walter was just a sensational talent for us for many, many years. His jersey deserves to be in the rafters at America West Arena." Great little quote there that summed up the impact that Walter had on the team on the court, and also read numerous articles as well where it inferred that he was part of a team that eventually got to get the Suns to the point where they moved into that new America West Arena and said goodbye to the old Madhouse on McDowell. Is that what it was referred to as?
Yeah. Veterans Memorial Coliseum. Walter, again, was the face of the team in the 80s. He was their big star along with Alvin Adams, who also had a great rookie year and then never really kind of recaptured that. When things went wrong for Walter and things went wrong for the team, it was no coincidence that those were connected. And people in Phoenix, to my recollection, there were people who were angry about what had happened because everybody liked Walter. Everybody wanted him to do well. Everybody wanted him to get better. And the fact that it wound up contributing to causing so much difficulty for the franchise just made everybody really sad. And so it was doubly hard when he left. Obviously, he wasn't going to stay with the Suns, but there wasn't a question in my mind that his number was going to be retired. He absolutely deserved that. And I think Colangelo made the right move by waiting a couple of years. I think that allowed more sympathy to come back into the equation among the fan base.
Beautifully said, mate. Now, at the time, Walter's number 6 jersey was just the 5th to be retired, along with Connie Hawkins, his famous number 42, the aforementioned Dick Van Arsdale and number 5, Alvin Adams and his number 33, and the great Paul Westphal and his number 44. So it was a fantastic honour just to be the 5th player in the franchise history to have their number put up into the rafters.
Yeah, I remember now that you mentioned the other names that were up there at the time with him, because he and Westphal went in pretty close together. Westphal was the coach of the team at that point. And I think the Suns kicked off that era of Westphal coaching by retiring his number, cementing his return to the Suns, even though he'd been an assistant coach for a couple of years ahead of that. I think that was an important thing. And I'm sure it meant a lot to Walter to join those guys. He played with everyone but Dick Van Arsdale. And he certainly knew Dick from the court. I know this is a favorite subject of yours, is his uniform, remember. He wore 24 in college, and he wore number 6 with the Suns. When he came to the Suns, Garfield Hurd was wearing number 24. And Garfield stayed with the Suns for another couple of years after Walter had been drafted. And then when he left, I think Walter was just so used to having the number 6 that he never switched it back. And so he wore 6 with the Suns for his entire Suns career. Walter is still the all-time leading Phoenix Suns scorer in franchise history. He scored 15,666 points as a Sun, and then added to that with Denver and with Portland. But he's still the number 1 guy on the Suns all-time list, which is really impressive.
That's a sensational stat. And I did read in the 1994 article about when his jersey was retired that he was the all-time Suns leading scorer at that time. And I didn't know that was still the case the best part of, 30 years later.
Yeah.
Incredible. Thanks again for that stat too. Another thing that I uncovered in the research for our chat today, in September of 2002, the Atlantic Coast Conference, aka the ACC, named their 50th anniversary basketball team, and it was voted on by a 120-person committee. No expense spared in getting them involved. Now, North Carolina led the way with 12 members on that 50-player team, and in alphabetical order, we've got Billy Cunningham, Brad Doherty, Walter Davis, Phil Ford, Bobby Jones, Michael Jordan, Larry Miller, Sam Perkins, Lenny Rosenbluth, Charlie Scott, and James Worthy. Tar Heels had 12 Duke had 11. So the Tar Heels just won out in that reference as well.
Imagine looking down the bench and seeing all of those players and you're ready to tip off against them. That would be terrifying. They've had some amazing players.
Be quite frightening. As we record this, mate, it was only about a week ago that the Phoenix Suns unveiled a reimagined Ring of Honor. At the celebration, Amari Stoudemire and Sean Marion were the latest inductees to the Ring of Honor. Walter Davis's name was called out, but he did not appear with the other members who were there in attendance.
With us tonight, inducted on April 3rd, 1994, named the 1977-78 NBA Rookie of the Year, six-time NBA All-Star and two-time All-NBA selection, the man with the velvet touch, Walter Davis.
Of course, nobody knew that just days later he would pass away, but from what I've read, he was in Charlotte, back home, visiting family at the time. Did you see the Ring of Honor and what Phoenix did to honor those past greats?
I've seen it. I did not know that Walter wasn't there. I didn't know anything about Walter's situation until a friend of mine, Mark Shields, wrote me and said, "Did you hear about Walter?" I was late getting to the news of that, but I have seen what they've unveiled, and I like it so much better than the Ring of Honor they had before with the names going around the arena on the concrete bases of the stands. Having banners, I think, in the rafters is much more classy, much more classical. I think Matt Ishbia, the new owner of the Suns, wanted to bring some of that sense of tradition back, and I think it's a great way to do it. There are also team achievement banners that are up there, Divisions 1, Western Conference finalists, things like that. And when Marion and Stoudemire join those guys later on this season, they're each going to get their own night of honor. Then it'll be a pretty spectacular group of guys that have been up there. Maybe not quite the level of the all-time tournament team of North Carolina players, but still some pretty good legends from NBA history, and Walter certainly deserves to be among them.
Is there anything else, mate, you'd like to add in terms of the impact of Walter, either on and off the court, making himself known to you throughout your Suns fandom before we do wrap up the episode?
It was just always awesome to see him in person, whether you saw him playing on the court or saw him around town. He was a Phoenix Sun. And for kids my age at that time, the Suns were gods in Phoenix. They were what everybody wanted to be, especially if you were any kind of sports fan. I'll always remember him taking a rebound down and starting the break for the Suns. His head down, his knees coming up almost to his chin as he was running. So smooth, dishing off without looking, worming his way into the lane and pulling up for an impossible shot. He had such great body control. I think if I were going to compare him to modern players, again, I see a lot of his game in Michael's game. Michael, again, much more explosive. But I think for his time, Walter was kind of like, and some of your listeners will know who this is, Rip Hamilton. There was a lot of that, I think, in Walter, in that he could score from anywhere. In terms of players playing today, like a Chris Middleton, Walter was just a guy who could score. When you put the ball in his hands, you had to account for him. He was always a threat. And I think a lot of the style of the way he played lives on today in today's game.
Very nicely said there, mate. So thanks again for joining me today. Obviously not the greatest of circumstances, but it's good to be able to recount the life and times of a truly great player in Walter Davis. Thanks for being a part of the show for a third time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Adam. And I appreciate you putting a spotlight on Walter Davis. He's kind of the forgotten man of those Suns teams. And now with his passing, unfortunately, there's been some talk about him in the context of the drug scandal, but also I'm glad that people are talking about what a great player he was, because I don't think he gets the recognition for his playing ability that he really deserves.
Until next time, all the best.
Good to see you. Bye.
Thanks for listening. I welcome your interaction with the show. Tap the microphone icon on my website to send me a voicemail. You can suggest discussion topics or guests you'd like to hear conversations with. Worldwide, the show has 203 ratings on Apple Podcasts with an average of 4.9 stars, with 101 reviews across all providers. Thanks for your continued support. If you add a review, I'd love to read it out on a future episode. Your ratings and reviews are one of the best ways to support the podcast. If you enjoy the show, please tell your basketball-loving friends about it. Word-of-mouth recommendations are truly worth their weight in gold. Stay up to date with my podcast and subscribe to my free monthly NBA history newsletter. You'll receive exclusive details on upcoming episodes, future guests to appear on the show, and more. Sign up via my website or simply email me inallairness@gmail.com. You can follow my show in various ways. Search In All Airness, 3 words, on your listening app of choice. The show is available on most platforms. Check the podcast archive for plenty more episodes with a great range of guests. Join me next time for another edition of the show.